Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. It's Thursday, it's 3 o'clock, which means we get to hang out again for the next hour, talking about agave, some things not agave, hopefully giving you guys a little bit of cultural insight this week. My guest is somebody who I have not known that long, but I feel very lucky to have come into the same circle with him. Ben Wilder, Professor Benjamin Wilder, rather, from the Tillamook Hill Desert Laboratory at the University of Arizona. Ben, how are you doing this afternoon, bud? Thanks so much for joining us.
All right. Fantastic, Francisco. Good to see you.
You too, my friend. Thank you so much again for taking the time out. For those of y'all who did not see my Facebook event announcement, Ben and I just met earlier this year, surprisingly, considering he works about 5 minutes from where I grew up, literally, at the Desert Laboratory in Tucson, Arizona. I talk about the desert all the time, as you guys know on the show. So I'm super excited to have somebody who is very, who is very integral into a lot of the research that's going on in that part of the country with the University of Arizona. We'll talk about that plenty. So Ben, just to give everybody an introduction to what it is that you do, if you don't mind explaining to us what it is, what the Desert Laboratory is, how that kind of functions, and what your role there is.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and as you were saying, man, so that when we actually got to meet was down in Michoacan and Guadalajara was kind of the last pre-COVID trip almost for me. And it was just, anyway, a mind-blowing trip. That was fantastic. So fun to think back to those times. We'll probably talk some about that too. So, yeah, I'm a botanist, desert ecologist by training, and also a biogeographer. So I study kind of where different species are and how they got there, and trying to use a lot of different approaches, different scientific techniques to understand essentially where life is and kind of the different processes that got it there. The Desert Laboratory on Tillamook Hill is a remarkable space. It is an ecological reserve that's kind of right in the heart of the city. We're just to the edge of downtown Tucson, kind of surrounded by the urban environment, but it's an 860-acre reserve area that is truly this confluence of science, culture, and community. And as you walk up, it's an 800-foot mountain, really, volcanic mountain that rises just above the Santa Cruz River here in the desert. That as you're walking up this mountain is a hell of a good exercise. And thousands of people do this. We have about 1,000 people, if not more, that walk the hill every day. But one of the things that's so interesting is as people are walking up here for exercise, they're actually walking through the history of our region. This site, Tillamook Hill, is actually named after the Tohono O'odham word. The O'odham are the indigenous peoples of this land. And that it means the hill of the horned lizard, or Chumamok, and which has been kind of changed to Tumamok. And so this has been, when you get to the top, you just have this view that looks over the entire valley. I mean, you can see everything from there. Everyone can see you. And it was a strategic space that's been continuously used by people for thousands of years. And then within that space, a scientific laboratory was established in the early 1900s by the Carnegie Institution, which really became the birthplace of desert ecology. Where I'm talking to you right now are these buildings that were established here in 1906. This is the library, and this is actually literally the room where the discipline of ecology was born in North America. And so there's this incredible history of science, in addition to culture, and then again that community piece of there. You know, we have over 500,000 different individual walks, probably on the order of 100,000 or so people that come to this space every year, but that probably don't really know much of the true layers of history here.
That's really, really incredible. I didn't really, I mean, I knew that the lab went back that far and was part of kind of the Carnegie Foundation, but I didn't realize that the Desert Lab was as you said, really kind of the birthplace of ecological study in North America. That's really, really remarkable.
Well, so so that the questions that they were asking at that time, going back 115 years, was how does plant life specifically adapt to aridity? And that's a kind of a fundamental question that at that point, the different types of photosynthesis, and we're kind of talking about agave. Agave has a remarkable type of CAM photosynthesis, which helps process and slow evaporation. But at so there was just kind of this frontier. It was like we knew as much about deserts in about 115 years ago as we do about the other planets right now. And that same question, though, is how does life adapt to aridity? Is that still our driving question? What is the future of life in the desert, especially with increasing extremes and climatic events that we're seeing everywhere? But you think about a desert species, and this is perfectly tapped into agaves, are so well adapted in many cases to these varying environments and these kind of thresholds, you could say, or these climate extremes. And so it's a fascinating area to be studying, and one that has applications across the board.
So before we get kind of too much into the meat of the episode, or rather, I would like to take just a little bit more time asking you about kind of your background and how you came to study ecology, desert ecology, and how it is that you came to actually be the director of the Desert Laboratory, because I consider us to be, I would imagine, around the same age, and that seems like a very daunting task, that level of academic achievement at this point in my career. So I'm really interested to kind of hear what drew you to the area. Obviously, I would imagine that you came up in Southern Arizona, and kind of how you decided to go down this path.
Yeah, so we share that we're both born and raised in Tucson, right? And so that imprints you. So I'm a desert rat for sure, and I'm out, and I'll kind of fill in the backstory, but I'm living the dream right now. Honestly, this is my dream job, and it's been a remarkable path that has taken me here. And it started with with my parents being unbelievably supportive and allowing me to go in any direction and space that I really wanted to. So my father's a chef, and I grew up in the restaurant industry, and so was very connected. I actually thought I was going in that direction through high school. I started doing caterings with my dad when I was 7, and just enjoyed that so much. But when I got kind of toward the end of high school, I realized that cooking wasn't my passion. And so I had been exposed a couple times through other family friends, and just growing up literally in the desert. Our house is on the west side of Tucson, out in the desert, and that again imprinted me on me. And so I kind of was like, I want to check out this whole conservation biology piece and studying science, which wasn't too much in my family exactly. And so and I just stumbled upon my passion, to tell you the truth. And so it was just like this expanse just opened up in front of me, and it continues to be in the case that like every question or observation leads to another question and another set of observation. It's like the ultimate rabbit hole in the most beautiful sense, where it's just like it's insatiable in terms of learning and trying to figure out how the system ticks, and what is this diversity around us, and how did it get here, and where is it going. So I had incredible mentors along the way, including some turned out to be who I didn't know at the time, but just kind of like legends in the field, including Ray Turner, who's an incredible desert ecologist and was one of the previous directors here at the Desert Laboratory. He was one of the first people to open this doors to me. I first met Ray through one of my best friends growing up, Seth Turner, his grandson. And then as my interest started to gravitate towards ecology, I realized, oh my God, Ray is like not just my grandfather figure, he's a grandfather figure for all of ecology. So that was and he's just one of the most amazing people. We recently lost him about 1.5 years ago. And then working with the incredible botanist Richard Felger, and then working with a remarkable conservationist and scientist Ezequiel Escuro. I did my PhD work in California, but also learning from mentors in Mexico and with indigenous communities, especially Humberto Romero Morales, who's with the Concac, or the Surrey people on the coast of the Gulf of California. And it's just like, I feel like each little door that opens, and then you kind of, with an opportunity, asking the right questions, you know, what plants occur on Isla Tiburon, and this is the largest island in the Gulf of California in Mexico, which I had the privilege to be able to visit and explore. And I came back with like wondering what plants occurred there, and that just led to working with Dr. Felger and then with Humberto. I mean, it's just this snowball, right? The thing, and I've just been so fortunate to kind of keep pulling that thread, and well, it's led me to this point. So it's pretty remarkable.
It really does sound remarkable. It seems like you live the life that I myself lead through Wikipedia, essentially, is where I will read about one thing, and then I notice a little highlight and get curious and check and click on that, and then just kind of keep going down that rabbit hole, and then just make all these really, really wonderful, really incredible connections. I will make one note, though, because I came from the bar restaurant industry. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that your father's not only a chef, but he's also a James Beard Award-winning chef for the Southwest region as well. So a quick shout out to Janos, who I have the pleasure of knowing, and has definitely left a mark on the culinary scene in not just Southern Arizona, but obviously the Southwest region. So going back and kind of looking at your profile and kind of some of the research that you've done, it looks like, forgive me if I'm wrong, but a lot of, I think you already kind of touched on a little bit, a lot of your work has been focused specifically on the Sonoran Desert, particularly in the northwest region of Mexico, as you mentioned, you know, because the Sonoran Desert doesn't only kind of, you know, isn't only focused on north central and northwestern Sonora as a state. It's a lot bigger than that. But it seems like a lot of your research, as you mentioned, has been focused working with the Surrey people, kind of near the Gulf of California and that region. Is that right? That's kind of where you focused a lot of your recent study?
Yeah, I mean, so I've got like we say, I got the desert bug and the Mexico, you know, inspiration for sure. So I've growing up here in Tucson, I was first kind of connected to our neighbors to the south in Sonora. I mean, I'll never forget when I first time saw the map of where the extent of the Sonoran Desert is, which again was made by researchers here at the Desert Laboratory in the 1950s. It didn't just encompass, you know, my backyard or our backyard here around Tucson in southern Arizona. It's the entire Baja California Peninsula and a good 2/3 of the parts of the state of Sonora. And like in Tucson, we're just in this tiny little corner up on the edge. And it also encompasses an entire sea, the Gulf of California. I mean, I invite anyone watching to just pull up Google Maps and just like look at the Baja California Peninsula and the Gulf of California. It's remarkable. So no, I've been spending a lot of time throughout the peninsula. When I went to do my PhD at UC Riverside, I just started bombing down south all the chance I could get, and then continued to kind of just expand in Sonora and as well as the peninsula.
And I think if you could kind of highlight for us a little bit, and I promise we're getting kind of to the agave portion of things, but I kind of want to set the stage, is you know, what is it about the Sonoran Desert that makes it such a remarkable place? Because it's kind of the collision of two. You have so much plant diversity, vertebrate diversity, etc. What really gives it that richness?
Wow, where do you start?
Without taking up the rest of the show, I guess.
Yeah,
I should
right?
say.
So you're prompting me here, Cisco. That's like one of my favorite topics. So I'd say, oh man, I'm working a lot with geologists these days. And I've got to say the geology kind of helps set the platform for all this, where you have, you know, the Gulf of California is so central to the story here. And you don't have the Gulf of California without this giant fault system, which is essentially the San Andreas Fault. 12 million years ago, you just get this rifting, and the peninsula that we now know it, like, broke off. It was attached to the mainland of Mexico and rifted up, you know, to the northwest. And then you created this sea. So that we get our, so the Sonoran Desert's interesting. It's right on the boundary of what's considered a true desert, meaning we average about 12 inches of rain a year. Although we'll see, hopefully we continue to stay about that, and maybe we may be getting truer desert than we'd like, especially if summers like this, we had a complete failure of the monsoons for the most part. But that you get a lot of life. It's not like the Sahara. It's not empty. And so much of that moisture that provides that life, it comes from evaporation from the Gulf of California. We get a monsoon system here in the summer that essentially you get this heating of the land that then sucks in this evaporated water from the Gulf, and that just brings life to everything. And so you have a whole bunch of tropical species that are adapted to this warm season rain that comes up. And so we have saguaros, for example, those evolved down in the south, in the tropics. So much of our diversity is tropically inclined. We see them, they grow and flourish in the summer. But at the same time, the other half of the amount of moisture we get is in the winter. And that is this cool season, kind of more temperate. You can think of like the jet or the California current and those kind of frontal storms that give most of California their rain in the cool season. That is the other half of the desert, which brings in this whole other set of species, especially annual species. So when we get big winter rains, you see those flush of wildflowers around. That's all kind of temperate winter adapted. So it's all these different sources of the diversity, and it truly makes the Sonoran Desert just this bounty of life and adaptations. There's so many different ways to exist here in the desert, and I think that's one of the things that makes it so amazing, is that you have influences of evolutionary strategies and adaptations from all over that mix here. And we're just talking about, we haven't even talked about going up in elevation with the mountains around.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of, that basin and range province that you have, and that area is one of the things that, and, obviously we don't have, we have plenty of episodes in the future, so I'm more than happy to have you back and we can really get into this. But for those that don't know, there's all these they're called sky islands. There's all these isolated little mountain ranges in these particular, at least around Tucson. So you get, you can go from roughly 2,000, 2,200 feet, whatever Tucson is at, all the way up to 7,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet in an hour's drive time. So you get this incredible, remarkable diversity as you go up in elevation.
Just to pause you there, sorry. That is so pivotal to the story of agaves and bats in our region too, because these Sky Island Mountains here are just like these splintering offshoots of the proper Sierra Madre Occidental, that runs through like most of Mexico, down like up, a good half, if not more. And so the bats, or the agaves, kind of follow that kind of corridor of mountains up north and sprinkled, and we'll talk about the role of humans in aiding that. And then the bats are following the flowering of those plants in their migratory routes, going north and then turning around and going south. So it's all, again, that's the geology, is this backbone of mountains where these plants are, and then the animals following them.
I mean, actually, that's perfect timing. I mean, the only thing I was going to add is, you talk about how saguaros originated further south in the tropics, but, being in Yegolé in southern Oaxaca, you have columnar cacti, you have trees that are, I believe, related to mesquite, related to palo verde, that are not necessarily the same plants, but are closely related. So it really blows me away when I first went there. The visual similarities, the climate similarities, really just completely blew me away, which is one of the reasons I think I immediately fell in love and fell at home in this environment. Was it just so readily reminded me of the Sonoran Desert in the plants, the wildlife, etc. That's in there.
It's the cradle of the desert there. I mean, the Valle de Tehuacan in that area is the cradle of the desert. You have some of the highest diversity of columnar cacti, certainly the highest in North America. And the Neobuxbaumia, one of the columnar cactus there, it's a close relative of the saguaro. And so that's kind of a desert formed by rain shadows. It's been a very persistent desert for millions of years. And so a lot of the evolutionary origin of our more recent desert here in the Sonoran Desert, this kind of northern fringe that comes and goes over the Pleistocene, the last 2.4 million years during these interglacial periods like we're in right now, it's all like the cradle again. That hub is exactly where you guys are working and then creating such incredible spirits from.
And the way you say it's that area is the cradle of the desert is like, that's one of the things that I really didn't appreciate until I actually read the natural history of the Sonoran Desert book that I had listed several weeks back on my kind of book list of what I think people should read. And that is the desert itself is kind of an evolving, living, breathing thing, right? As you say, the desert climate kind of has migrated north into where you are rather, in Tucson, and kind of the northern regions of that desert climate. And that desert really has been there for thousands of years. And the border like ebbs and flows, and it is changing and evolving as the climate changes, and it responds to that. So it's not this static, this static thing. It is living, it is breathing, it is constantly evolving and moving. And that was one of the things that really just kind of opened my eyes and how I think about these climates, not just the desert climates, but climates all over the world, really, is how adaptive they are, how responsive they are, and kind of how, obviously, we're talking about the desert writ large, and then you zoom in and talk about a specific plant or a specific animal, whether that's bats or whether that is agave, and it really just shows you how the interconnectedness of everything, right? And I'm sure that sounds cliche, but for me personally, it wasn't something that I really wrapped my entire head around until I realized that that desert itself is a living, breathing thing.
It's exactly right. And I think one layer, just to add, just go one step in addition to that, or to expand on, is it's so dynamic that it's not, I think there can be a misconception when we say the desert moves north and south. It does, but it's not the desert I see out my window right now. The community of the Sonoran Desert we know today is made up of individual species that have individual responses to climate changes. And we know that for a fact in the past, and we see it happening right now. And so to think that the whole desert kind of, the ironwoods and palo verdes and saguaros like pick up their bags and kind of move together at the same time over, thousands of years is not the way it is. Each species is kind of, again, because they have certain set of adaptations that are individualistic, even at the population level. And we are learning so much more about that through genetics and full-scale genome studies, that I think it's really important for all of us to know that as we're getting into this increased period of change, that each species is really responding in its own way. And then that raises so many questions about the interactions between species, plants and animals, and so on and so forth.
So speaking of that interaction between plants and animals, you mentioned earlier about kind of how that basin and range system is so formative for kind of the relationship between agave and bats, and how humans are responsible for kind of helping to shape that. Could you touch on that a little bit more? Because I'm sure that piqued the Mezcal geeks' interest a little bit.
Which part specifically you want me, the human piece or the more of the kind of the geography?
Let's start with the geography, and then we can kind of go into the human piece, because I'd kind of like to get the full, kind of 360-degree view.
So the geography piece, I think, is interesting. Again, maybe just to paint the picture. So you have this incredible massive mountain range, the Sierra Madre, that runs through much of the kind of western coast of Mexico, and that is the heartland for so much agave and agave production spaces, and that incorporates kind of just around, well, really it's starting just where we were down near Michoacan in that area, and then running north. So when you get up to the northern Sonora, southern Arizona, it splinters into these different mountain ranges and these what we call sky islands, because they're mountains surrounded by kind of a sea of desert. And so you get a lot of increased diversification of different species that occur on these different kind of mountain ranges. But then, of course, you get these valleys in between where you also get more desert adapted species that drop down. And so one of the things that we're finding is this connects a little bit to DOs, or denominations of origin. So Perfect. The species that you get in Sonora that are referred to as Bacanora is of course not just one species, there's a whole set, and some of them are widely spread. But they're quite distinct than what you get in Chihuahua that makes sotol. And even, of course, sotol is not even from an agave, it's from a Dazzlerian. Although I've seen some agaves that are branded as sotols in Chihuahua. So anyway, so you start to get this real interesting diversification as you get north into the desert, as you drop into the lowlands. And that then is, so now is where, let's get up into Arizona. This diversity goes all the way up to the Grand Canyon and beyond. And there's been some incredible work by Wendy Hodgson and Andrew Solomon and other collaborators. They're based at the Desert Botanical Garden, working with Gary Navhan, who I hope that you'll be able to have on this series later. And anyway, that showing that many of these species are kind of domesticates, meaning that these are species that have been cultivated and selected and kind of manipulated, hybridized by people. And that much of the diversity of the of agave species we're seeing in Arizona actually kind of created by people. And so then you start to get this really fascinating gray area of what does like that kind of bat or pollinator induced adaptation, evolution, and where do people start coming in and forming that diversity we see in the agave species.
I don't think I realized, like, so how much as things evolve, have you been able to see kind of this differentiation kind of in real time as far as the species are concerned? Or is it more, I guess that's my question really, is are you able to watch these changes kind of happen?
I mean, there's a great time is slippery, right? When you start talking about these kind of questions. So real time, what does that mean exactly? Yes, we are seeing evidence that on the scale of several centuries, we're trying to pin down the exact time right now, but I would say 500 to 1,000 years, we're seeing the evidence of people directly affecting the direction and shape of agaves, and that is just kind of can be sped up. It's a fascinating question. We're not entirely sure because how it depends. Agaves have fairly long generation time, so this isn't like a fruit fly that you're just breeding in the lab and can see. Massive. But at the same time, you get these pups that come off, and you can take them, and so you can. I think you can select for character traits that you're looking for relatively fast, and so. Well, yes, I would say we are seeing direct evidence for human manipulation of agave species on real time, which is, several hundred to 1,000 years on the long end.
I mean, obviously, you can point to what I would think would be the most obvious example of that, and that's the Blue Weber agave for tequila production, right? I mean, because that is an entire monoculture that is based on human selection of traits that they're looking for in a particular agave species, right?
And it runs that gradient from that massive scale to, again, people, spirit producers or agave cultivators on a very small scale up in the mountains that are just, picking the plants that mature faster, that maybe create pup more, that, there's dozens and dozens of characteristics people are looking for in it. So it happens both on the micro scale in the landscape, but also in the lab and on this mega scale too.
And then also like on a combination of the two, because I've met producers who run across kind of a natural cross-pollination that they had, or natural hybridization that they had not seen before, but they decide to not harvest that plant and decide to actually let it flower and seed so that then they can continue that, right? So then you have what seems to be this natural hybridization, but gaining a foothold because of human intervention.
Yep.
I want to kind of shift gears slightly. Maybe not. I do not have the most elegant kind of subject shifts, but I would like to kind of go back to something that we touched on in our email correspondence and kind of get back to what you were talking about working with the Surrey people, because you have done a bit of work kind of focusing on and I guess it does tie into kind of agave species diversification, right? Because the knowledge that people have about these plants, the traits that they're looking for, how to select, is something that is really largely because of the time scale that agave plants grow on, right, is very much cultural knowledge, indigenous knowledge that is being handed down, particularly I think of Tio Rey and the Blancos that he's harvested, that his grandfather planted, right? So a lot of the characteristics and a lot of the knowledge that he gains is from his father and his grandfather, because these plants are decades old by the time that they're ready to be harvested, right? So I really want to ask, you've done a lot of work, and I don't know how much of your career you've devoted to that, but I know that you've worked a lot in the role that indigenous knowledge plays in scientific study, right? And that's we were talking about the paper that I read. Could you tell us a little bit about that, about kind of some of the projects that you've been involved with?
Yeah, it's a remarkably rewarding space to work in, and I've been fortunate to kind of early on, when I started pursuing some of those questions we were talking about early on, and being welcomed and starting to collaborate early with the CONCAC, with the series, and for them inviting me and sharing their lands with me and their knowledge of the plants, and we were just kind of, as we say in the botany world, just baling hay, going out and collecting and identifying what the species are, and Humberto is incredible. He self-trained himself with the book that one of my mentors, Richard Felger, and Mary Beck Moser wrote, the Ethnobotany of the Surrey people, people of the desert and sea. And Humberto, it's a book in English. He doesn't read English, but he trained himself knowing learning the scientific names, and then the common Spanish names, so of course the names in Quinquitom, or the language of the Surrey people. And so this interchange of knowledge just started happening. That, for me, that was my intro. And I'll never forget going to, I'll share a story. So went down in 2006. I'm an undergraduate. It was my first time going to one of the Surrey villages, and Felger didn't go. He just kind of sent me with essentially just tell them, here's a book, and go. So I went, connected with Humberto, and introduced myself, and said the concept of the project, that we wanted to work on the islands, and literally within a couple hours of having met him, we were landing on Isla Tiburon. So we crossed a narrow channel. This is we're in central Sonora, just off the coast, and drive up into this wonderful mountain range called the Sierra Concac that is largely unexplored. And we get out of the car and we walk, and we get to this canyon, the edge of this canyon, and Humberto pauses and sings the song for the plants and their language, and there was just this, everything just paused, and he said, okay, where do you want to go? Let's begin. And it was just that this whole world opened up in front of me. And so since then, it's just been following those gifts, and there's so much knowledge contained in so many different ways to see the world. And so that's, I think, what is, to me, one of the cornerstones of traditional ecological knowledge is a understanding of the ticking of the planet on scales that we are so disconnected to right now. And it's an understanding of the rhythms, the cycles, the pulses, the challenges, the gifts, the bounty, and the nuances of species that and the interactions of species and the timing that sustain life. And so one of the things that was really powerful about the collaboration with the CONCAC, Humberto, and many others that we've continued over the years is there's this kind of, we come from wildly different worlds, but we rapidly settle on this point of collaboration, which is of great interest in the natural world. And so there's you pass through all these barriers of different cultures with just the questions of what's this plant and what does it do? It's just boom, there you are. All that other stuff, like language or upbringing or anything. It's like, no, you're there in that moment, connecting on the diversity and the beauty of the world, and trying to understand it. And so that there's it's such an interesting space, because then there's different ways to understand those objects, or that diversity. And so and that's where you get this kind of classified as traditional ecological knowledge, or traditional knowledge, and then kind of Western science. And a lot of those times they're fairly seamless, the knowledge that goes between those, in terms of even names. Like, so the binomial system that we use for scientific names, the genus, species, that was kind of invented by Linnaeus, is also used in many times in folk taxa, as it's referred to. For example, one of the Surrey names is Hop Kauk, which is means Hop is the XOP Kauk for large bursera, and that's Bursera laxiflora is our name. So so sometimes this knowledge kind of connects, and then other times it's wildly different, and the stories and the knowledge that leads up to an understanding of a species or its history is one way of seeing it in the traditional sense, and a completely different way of seeing it in Western science. And that rub, that friction in the sense of creative tension, is a remarkable space to explore, because I think different ways of seeing the world aren't just about spaces of conflict. They're actually spaces for understanding. And when you have a common interest in an object, it's a very rich space to explore. So yeah, that has been such a rewarding space. And now kind of shifting to what we're doing here on the Hill with Agave, it's working with a different culture, the Tonatam, which are the indigenous culture of this region, and they're a sovereign nation with a totally different knowledge set. And so for myself, I'm working on developing those relationships and exploring and educating myself and learning to establish those relationships now.
So, you've spent a lot of time, kind of working to bring those two worlds together, right? And it's I'm not 100% sure. This is my kind of assumption, kind of what it seems from the little bit of research that I've done, is that incorporation, or that very deliberate effort to incorporate traditional knowledge into kind of the Western science realm, it seems like a relatively new effort in its deliberateness, I guess, because I would imagine that when Western science first started to explore these places, right, obviously they knew nothing about them, so they had to incorporate some indigenous knowledge, but without maybe an appreciation for it 100%. Maybe I'm wrong, but it seems as though I've been seeing people obviously this is mainly kind of in my world, in these parts of Central, North, South America, and in these pursuits, it seems like there's a renewed appreciation, I guess is the best way to say it, for this indigenous knowledge, for this traditional ecological knowledge, and how to incorporate that into Western science. Or has that always been, in the academic community, a continuing theme that maybe society writ large didn't quite understand or appreciate, or is it kind of a new thing?
There's an increased recognition of that there's a better way to have meaningful partnerships and relationships with indigenous people. There has certainly been, there's an element of colonialism and disempowerment here. There's an element of generational changes, just things change over generations and how you do things. And then there's an element of earnest collaborations, kind of where, I have a meeting of mutual interest. And so I'd say that there's, on the academic side, there's long been individuals coming from the Western science approach that have genuinely respected and work to inquire and to learn from other ways of seeing the world. It's kind of under the large umbrella of ethnographic work. Also, but kind of a subfield, you could say, of anthropology. But I think there's a recognition of how that, what is the better ways to approach that now? And and specifically, so rather than just going in and coming in and trying to say, okay, these are my goals, this is all the information I want, can you please work with me and give me that? We're grading towards, this is the questions I'm interested in, but what are your interests, and where can we collaborate? What are your priorities for your community, for you as an individual, for your culture, for your nation? And that involves working with individuals, involves working with communities, with elected officials, with councils. Each community is a different process. So in the bottom line is that it takes time, and it takes patience, and it takes a willingness to not work on a Western schedule and to not have things unfold the way we're used to or wanting it to. So yeah, I think we're going in positive directions, and I think there's parallel tracks to reawakening happening throughout our society right now with Black Lives Matter, with recognition of the disenfranchisement of women, and the disenfranchisement and erasure that's happened for Indigenous people is absolutely on that. And I hope we see it take a larger portion of the stage as well, because it's a really serious issue, and there's a lot of things we can do a lot better.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you just mentioned, parallel tracks, and just to illustrate that, I mean, even today on, there's a big one of the largest beverage conferences, drinks conferences, spirits conferences in the world going on right now. Normally I would be in Louisiana for Tales of the Cocktail in New Orleans, but they're doing it digitally. And one of the seminars this morning was appreciation versus appropriation, right? And there's definitely been, and given the fact that it is a very prevalent issue today across several discourses, and particularly working in the agave space, the mezcal space. That's definitely a very common topic these days, and it's so hard. It's a very hard subject to approach with people, I think, because people are sensitive sometimes, and people, no matter how well intentioned, it's very awkward to tell people that they could be doing better at what it is that they're doing. So to be able to illustrate that to people, that it's something that happens across platforms and across spheres is really important, I think, for me, because one of the things that you talked about in the paper that I was reading was kind of the incorporation of this knowledge along with linguistic preservation, right? Because language being so important and kind of one of the bedrocks, one of the foundations for culture, and kind of showing people, for me personally, it was great to see that, because it really illustrated to me how interconnected these things are, right? Because these people have lived in these environments forever. They've been the stewards and the caretakers of these environments forever. And, once you get rid of language, you start to go down the path of removing culture. Once you remove culture, you remove those people. And once you remove those people, you take them out of that environment, right? And then that environment seems to be lost to a certain extent.
It's so true. And it's, I think with the agave space and in the spirit production, especially with mezcal, is a really interesting additional layer here, where the knowledge bearers and the tradition keepers in this case are largely not necessarily indigenous individuals. They're kind of more campesino or ranching families that go back generations, and so the knowledge that they hold and maintain is in its own sphere, but in many ways has a lot of comparisons with indigenous knowledge. It is this close understanding of the landscape, a close understanding of the the individual plants, the seasons, I mean, the nuances, just everything we were talking about. And so it's, and in many times, some of these families do have indigenous roots, and other times they don't. But I think it's a whole nother tier, I think, to the conversation. There's parallels to this too in Baja California, of these communities in the southern mountains in the Sierra San Francisco, Sierra La Giganta.
Yes, I read, yes, please go. I love this part of the paper. It was fascinating.
The Los Californios, which is incredible. They are generations, multi-generations ranching families that truly maintain a way of life that's not found elsewhere. I mean, this has come from the original ranching tradition going back several centuries. And unfortunately, so much of the indigenous population was completely wiped out on the peninsula due to disease primarily. And so these are the kind of the remnant of the people that are left on the landscape who know the most about the landscape in the peninsula. So I just think it's an incredibly complicated conversation space, but when we're talking about agave spirits, that local knowledge that is maintained by these producers that you work with, that so many of the people in the field, in the trade work with, their knowledge, it's pure gold, right? It's what makes this so damn good. You can taste, and that's what the best thing about mezcal is you can taste that knowledge in a glass of mezcal. So it's a beautiful element to it, and I think it's along with this kind of, as we're talking about traditional ecological knowledge, I see it firmly rooted within the makers of the products that we're talking about.
100%, and one of the things I kind of got excited for a moment when we started talking about this was because, I've focused on agave spirits for almost the last decade of my life. And it's very rare that you can see the intersection of so many different parts of life in a bottle of distilled spirit, right? And there's people who absolutely love mezcal for a variety of different reasons, right? But one of the things that I try and illustrate to people is that it is agave spirits are kind of singular in the pantheon of distilled spirits in how interconnected they are to the natural environment, to culture, etc. And because of that, it almost demands of consumers a little bit more care and a little bit more curiosity to learn about that interconnectedness, because it covers such a vast expanse across Mexico, of a country, of a part of the world that is so diverse in cultures and climates, etc. And the only way to really give a full appreciation for what's in that bottle is to take the time to go down those rabbit holes, right? And learn about the different cultures in the different parts of Oaxaca, or I mean, of Mexico rather, where these spirits are created. Just one small example is Mezcal Vago. We work with producers in different parts of Oaxaca, but they don't speak Zapotec. And I think that's a very common misconception for people who consume mezcal, is that, oh yes, this is southern Oaxaca, everybody's Zapotec, etc. And I at trade shows and stuff, I think I meet a lot of people who are kind of surprised to hear that the producers that we work with don't necessarily speak Zapotec, or don't live in what traditionally are what are historically Zapotec villages. And that's just one little snapshot of Oaxaca, and that's one state, and there's one state where so many different cultures are prevalent or exist. And it's great that people are buying and consuming these products, but I hate to make it a little bit less, just make it more serious than people think it needs to be. But consumers have a certain responsibility, I think, to preserve the cultures that are making these spirits, because they're so connected to the land, to the history of these places.
One thing I've been thinking about lately is, and I agree that there is an important piece on the consumer's side, and I think that that's heightened in the agave spirit realm, in the sense that it started so wrong. One of the things our trip connected me to was that industrialized tequila production, it's gotten to make profits. It's what, you know, I grew up knowing, right? Like I was like, I'll get a, you know, in college, I'll get a bottle of Patron. I'm doing the, you know, this is the good stuff. And it's like, holy crap, this is the pinnacle of abuse. This is like the pinnacle of stripping everything beautiful we're talking about out of the bottle and just creating profits. And so that, like, I feel like there's, in talking with your question, Francisco, about like creating, what's that evolution like in the academic space of working with cultures, I feel like that's happening in the agave space so much right now, where it's like, it got to this point where it's just like, wow, like most of the industry is just kind of made up of crap. And in that pulling that authentic nature and that true agave culture by that biocultural diversity you get in a wonderful glass of authentic, beautiful mezcal is, that's kind of that's at the forefront of what you all are doing. And so, but that takes a lot of discernment on the consumer's part to kind of know, to wade through all of those options when you're looking at the liquor store. It's just, I've been thinking a lot about how our trip that David Surrey organized and opened my eyes so much to the history and the evolution of the tequila industry. And it's, and anyway, it's at a fascinating point right now, in terms of the beautiful options that are being created and those relationships that are being sourced and brought to market across the sphere.
You know, and for me personally, it's a very exciting time because I feel like we're starting to be not necessarily at a tipping point, but it's a very dynamic point, I think, in the history of these spirits, because there's so many different routes that a brand or an importer, et cetera, can take. And I'm excited to see some of the paths that some projects are going, right? Del Maguey, for example, is starting kind of an audio Zapotec dictionary for language preservation, and you know, there's really on the botany side of things, there's brands that are really focused on their nurseries, ourselves being one of them. Neta is another example, you know, and Respiral as well, working really hard on the scientific botany kind of species preservation side of things and focusing on the biodiversity of the agave plants themselves. And there's so many, and the Bat Friendly project, for example, right, that our friend David is, and our other friend Rodrigo Medellin are so keyed in on, and such a driving force for these changes and kind of the ways that people think about these spirits, what we can do, what we can achieve on these spirits as far as environmental awareness, cultural preservation, etc. And then on the flip side of that, right, there's people who are kind of manufacturing culture or introducing culture where it doesn't necessarily belong, and kind of, you know, you can, you know, so many brands are putting Dia de los Muertos motifs on their branding, etc. You know, things like that, or adding a level of mysticism to mezcal, even though the producers may not incorporate that into their production process, just to make it a little bit more exotic or a little bit more romantic. You know, like I said, there's so many different strategies a brand can take, but I am encouraged to see some of the really awesome directions that some brands are going. We're really excited to be active in getting our Bat Friendly certification, of which there's only a handful of brands. So there's really awesome projects like that give me a lot of hope for where spirits are headed.
An exciting example of that from our neck of the woods here is, there was just this great award, a grant award that was given to Borderlands Restoration, that was given by the Salazar Center. It was a national competition, and it was talking about connectivity and biodiversity and conservation. Anyway, the Borderlands project is the Bacanora and bats, and it's working with a nonprofit in Sonora that is established the relationship with the essentially the state representative for the Bacanora industry to do plant outs and sustainable harvesting of the species of agave that go, well, this is across brands, right? This is at like the central kind of organizational level for Bacanora, which is at a critical time right now, because Bacanora, there are just some really important laws that were passed that allowed kind of an easier introduction into the market, into the US. And so the increase of harvesting is going to really ramp up. So totally to your point, there's just some really cool, and that, I think, I love this example because it's nonprofits, academia, and producers coming together to address some of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. The Tequila Interchange project, again, another really great example of another project that is organized across less brand focused and more kind of academic and on the consumer side more than anything. I mean, there's a lot of the Tequila Interchange project was originally focused on outreach to bartenders, which I think really set up a great model for how to educate. We're just talking about getting consumers to pay attention to these things that are happening in this industry and kind of how to support these kinds of projects. And, outreach to bartenders, to, wine and spirit shop buyers, getting them excited about these projects, educated about these projects, excited about these projects, and then relaying that excitement, sharing that excitement with their customers or their guests, I think is really vital, because a lot of these projects, forgive me, please correct me if I'm wrong, but they take a lot of money. And a lot of time in these kinds of projects in academia, often that money can be a little bit difficult to come by.
To your point, every piece of that chain makes a difference, right? And in that knowledge and that excitement of in being able to convey that is just so important. And I would say that it's a two-headed coin there. I'm always amazed at how much scrappy NGOs and scientists can do with a little amount of money. And it literally, in this case, has been just planting seeds. And it's a beautiful thing what dedication can do. And then that dedication will lead to maybe some larger infusions of capital from big brands or granting agencies or whatever. But I do take a little disagreement with that. I think you can do so much with very little, and it just comes from the heart and the persistence.
That's fantastic to hear. Thank you so much, Ben. We are down to just about a couple minutes, so I would love to say thank you so much. I did want to ask you, we'll kind of wrap up, where are some of the resources that people can go to learn kind of more about desert ecology and what you guys are doing at the Desert Laboratory?
Yeah, sure. So our website is kind of a good platform for that, tumamoc.arizona.edu, tumamoc.arizona.edu. And that you'll see, so I would also, what if you had to get one book? Oh my God, I'm putting myself on the spot. Like, what is that classifies what we've been talking about? Geez, I'm gonna totally whiff here. There's so many. Okay, this is for Agave folks. Go for you all. This is gonna be a little more technical than maybe you want, but everyone that works with Agave should have Howard Scott Gentry's Agaves of Continental and North America.
This is an old copy right here. If anybody, they're hard to come by, but I think that you can find some reprints on Amazon from time to time.
Yeah, that's and I mean, just read the introduction to that alone. It's beautiful. And so Howard Scott Gentry has kind of given us, I'm following his inspiration with the project we're working on agaves right now. Is called the Human Agave Symbiosis, which is how the agave plant has given so much to people for millennia. But at the same time, as we've been talking about, people shape and bring out and increase the health and diversity of the agave. It's that symbiotic, that positive relationship. So that's a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Ben, it's been absolutely great to talk to you. This has definitely been one of my favorite conversations we've had. And I feel like we're just scratching the surface on how interconnected all of these things really are. So I would love to have you back on when we can kind of isolate a couple of subjects and really kind of go down the rabbit hole if you're up to it. But thanks so much for joining me this afternoon.
Francisco, thank you. Yeah, we'll give you an update in a year or so, or maybe less, when we get our Agave project up and running here.
Absolutely. I really, really look forward to it, bud. Please take care of yourself. Say hi to everybody there for me on behalf of not just myself, but Mezcal Vago as well. And have a wonderful afternoon, bud. Stay safe.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks.